Hi, I'm AdroitWiz and I've done a lot of AMV style editing for CMRB. Naturally, that involves a lot of rotoscoping. In this tutorial video, I'm going to go over the 3 rotoscoping techniques I use in After Effects for cartoon footage. The first technique is regular old masking. I typically use this for clips where there's little to no movement. To demonstrate this, I'll be using this clip of Saitama. You'll notice that while most of Saitama's outline doesn't change, his jaw does move during the animation. In situations like these, I like to use multiple masks. One mask for everything that doesn't move, then additional masks for the animated parts. To start, click the pen tool. If the layer I'm trying to mask out is already transformed so only part of it is visible, I'll double-click it in the timeline to open up the layer view, which shows the whole, untransformed layer. It doesn't really matter where you start drawing the mask. To start with, we'll zoom in with the scroll wheel and pan using the middle mouse button until we can see the outline up close. To draw a point, we click along the outline and drag. You'll notice that as we drag, 2 handles appear around the point created where we first clicked. These are Bezier curve handles, and they control the curviness of the mask segments we're drawing. Drawing masks using curves is important if you don't want them to look sloppy. Future Adroit here. If you just click to create a point without doing any dragging, it'll create a pointy point. You can convert this to a smooth point by holding down Alt and then clicking on the point. After Effects picks a random color for the mask. If the color makes the mask hard to see against the clip, just click the colored square next to the mask in the timeline and select a different color. The process for drawing masks is basically just adding more points. Click and drag, and so on. You'll notice that the curve handles determine the shape of the curve segment. This is something you'll get the hang of as you go, but you can always go back and adjust them. By default, both handles are an equal distance from the point, but you can drag them around to have more or less influence on their neighboring curve segments. Eventually, you'll hit a corner. In order to make the curve points, well, pointy, hold down the Control key while dragging a handle. This time, the handle on the opposite side won't move along with it. And you can properly mask out the corner. If you want to make a pointy point turn smooth again, hold down Alt and click it to remove the handles, then Alt-click it again to bring the handles back. When they return, they'll stay aligned again. You can add a point in the middle of an existing segment by clicking along that segment, and you can delete a point by clicking on it to select it, and then pressing the Delete key. You'll notice that selected curve points appear solid, and non-selected curve points appear hollow. Adding more points to the current mask only works if the currently selected point is at one of the ends of the mask. If the currently selected point is in the middle of the mask, clicking will start an entirely new mask. Also, if you click off of the layer, and then try to get back to the mask by clicking on it or its path in the timeline, you'll notice that all the mask points turn square, and trying to drag one moves all of them. To get back to normal, click Masks, plural. This should turn the points circular, indicating that you can now drag them individually again. Why After Effects does this is beyond me. If there's a way to turn this off, let me know. Future Adroit here. It turns out that if you select an individual mask, After Effects will actually select all of its individual points. If you want to just drag one point, you can shift-click the point that you want to drag, hence deselecting it, and then regular-click it again to select it. Since we're masking out Saitama's jaw separately, we'll go ahead and ignore it for now. Once you've closed the mask path, the clip will appear masked out. Unfortunately, we didn't mask out Saitama's jaw because it's animated and we're leaving that to a separate mask. Now it's invisible. To fix this, open the mask in the timeline and change Add to None, which temporarily disables the mask. You'll notice there are a lot of options there that control how the mask behaves, but I only use a few. None disables the mask, Add masks things in, and Subtract masks things out. In order to avoid accidentally modifying the existing mask when drawing a new one, we can temporarily lock it with this toggle box. This will make all of its points undraggable. Now we can get started on the second mask. It's easiest to start on the first frame of animation. Draw the mask, and then set it to none as well so that we can see the animation. Now make sure you open the mask in the timeline view, and enable keyframing on the mask path property by clicking the stopwatch. I've forgotten to do this a few times, and it's painful having to mask out several frames of animation all over again because you forgot to record your keyframes. Now right-click on the keyframe in the timeline, and click Toggle Hold Keyframe. The keyframe should now look something like this. Basically, this stops After Effects from trying to animate between the keyframes we set, and jump between keyframes instead. For live-action footage, it's useful to be able to animate between mask shapes, but for cartoon footage where things only change every 2 to 3 frames, it should be disabled. Now go through and adjust the mask for every frame of animation. You can hold down Control while pressing the arrow keys to move one frame at a time. Don't go too fast though, After Effects sometimes lags a bit and it can take a couple seconds to update the view. Pay attention to whether the animation starts looping. You can save a lot of time by copying and pasting previously used keyframes. The masking process is now complete. You can re-enable the masks now by changing None back to Add. One thing I like to do now is go back into the composition view, solo the layer with this toggle. Turn off the checkerboard and mask path visibility, and see if there are any tiny slivers of the background showing through. If any are showing, just drag the mask inwards a bit to fix them. The Rotobrush is an automatic-ish rotoscoping tool that can save a lot of time. Typically, the results are a bit blockier than if you use regular masking, but it's fast enough that the sacrifice is typically worth it. One important thing to know about the Rotobrush is that it works best with high-quality footage. This means clear outlines and high resolution. Do not rip your videos from YouTube. For reasons that I'll explain shortly, I'll be using 2 clips to demonstrate the Rotobrush. The first is this clip from Gumball.
Oh, dude, I am so sorry.
The second is this clip from My Hero Academia.
Midoriya.
To start with, you'll want to pre-compose the clip you're using, leaving all attributes in the original composition in order to avoid this error. Sometimes, the time cursor in the pre-comp will reset to the beginning of the footage. To easily seek to the part of footage you're using in the edit, go back to the parent composition and position the time cursor to the start of the clip there. Then open up the pre-comp again, and the time cursor should update to match. If you want to mask out an entire shot, seek around a bit using the Control key and arrow keys again, to ensure you're not missing any frames off the beginning or end of the shot. That can happen sometimes if the frame rate of the composition where you trimmed the footage doesn't match the frame rate of the footage itself. Now, select the Rotobrush tool, and double-click the layer to open up the layer view. When you hover over the clip, your cursor should appear as a green circle with a plus in the middle. The size of the circle indicates the size of the Rotobrush stroke, and the green plus indicates that anything you draw on will be masked in. You can hold Control and drag to change the brush size, and if you hold Alt while drawing, it'll mask out anything you draw on instead of masking it in. To start, just draw on the rough area you want to mask in. Be conservative. The Rotobrush will never automatically mask out any areas where you have actually drawn the brush stroke. Notice that a pink outline now appears over the parts you drew over. This indicates the border between masked in and masked out parts. This outline is actually affected by these Rotobrush adjustment settings, so in order to more precisely view what the Rotobrush algorithm is actually doing, I like to turn the feather setting down to 0. The feather setting essentially smooths out the rough edges of the mask by blurring it slightly, and while it's useful as a final step, it gets in the way of being able to see what the raw, unprocessed mask looks like. Now we can start masking things in more. Draw over the parts that haven't been masked in yet, and hold Alt while drawing over parts that have been masked in but shouldn't be. Remember that you can adjust the brush size for masking fine details. You may notice that up to this point I haven't been paying much attention to the black outline surrounding Gumball. This actually leads into a question you'll often end up asking when using the Rotobrush: to outline or not to outline? The Rotobrush is tuned for live action footage where objects don't have black outlines the way they do in cartoons. As such, the Rotobrush doesn't handle outlines very well, and you'll often spend a lot of time masking in outlines that the algorithm excluded from the mask. There are ways to add an outline back in later, but they work best on thin outlines that don't play a major part in the animation. Also, the Rotobrush typically handles thicker outlines better. As such, I'll typically try to mask in thicker, more defined outlines like those typically found in Western cartoons. Outlines whose widths vary also need to be masked in. For thinner, sometimes blurry outlines, a style typically found in anime, I find it's much easier not to mask them in. For this clip of Gumball, we'll be masking the outlines in. To do this, drag the brush along the inner edge of the outlines wherever they're not masked in. Do this bit by bit, so if you end up undoing a brush stroke, you'll lose less progress. You'll notice that in these darker areas, the Rotobrush needs a lot more help. It's a lot easier to see the edges if you turn up the brightness. Once the first frame is perfectly masked out, hold down Control and use the arrow keys once more to move frame by frame until you encounter the next frame of animation. Make sure to take this slowly. It can take up to several seconds for the view to update in some cases, and you'll want to make sure you start drawing on the first video frame where the animation frame advances. If you do end up drawing a frame late though, it's no big deal. Open the Rotobrush effect in the timeline, open the strokes detail, click the first late brush stroke, then shift-click the last one to select all the ones in between, and drag them all back a frame. The process from here on out is pretty simple. Just go frame by frame, fixing any mistakes the algorithm makes with your brush. This might take anywhere from seconds to minutes per frame depending on how much After Effects hates you. If your character stays still for more than about 15 frames, the Rotobrush will stop working. If this happens, just throw in another brush stroke before the last frame hits, and you'll get another 15 frames to work with. Once you're done, click the freeze button to pre-render the effect. That isn't strictly necessary, but I find it speeds things up significantly when you view the clip in the timeline. Once the rotoscoping itself is done, you'll need to clean up the outline. To start with, increase the feather setting that we turned down earlier. You'll want it to be high enough that any blockiness or stair-stepping goes away, but not so high that sharp corners start to get filled in with the background color. There's still a brightly colored outline around some of the edges though, so to get rid of it, the next step is to enable Decontaminate Edge Colors. Then, open the Decontamination Detail thingy, and turn up Increase Decontamination until the background no longer leaves a crusty outline along the edges of the clip. Don't increase it so much that it removes the outline color though. Now let's try Deku. The masking process is pretty much the same, but this time we won't try to mask in the outlines. For some clips, we might explicitly mask the outlines out whenever the Rotobrush includes them, but that can get tedious. Plus, there are some parts like Deku's hair where there is no outline in the first place. Now you'll notice that some parts of the outline are included and others aren't. To hide this, we'll first turn up the feather a bit, then use Shift Edge to bring the mask inwards a bit, then we'll turn on Decontaminate Edge Colors again, but this time we'll increase the decontamination enough that any outline gets removed. Finally, we'll add the stroke layer style. It's important to add this inside the pre-comp, otherwise it'll interfere with things like motion blur. Set the size to something that looks realistic given the footage, and I find that it often looks better if the color isn't pure black. I usually use the color picker to pick an almost black color from the footage itself. And we're done with the roto brush. This is probably the hardest technique to explain, so bear with me. This technique only works on clips where the things you're trying to key out have thick, distinctive outlines that stand out from the background. To demonstrate this, I'll be using this clip from Adventure Time.
Now it's 1,000 years later and I'm still messed up.
The first step is to add the color range effect to the clip, and then use the eyedropper to select the color of Marceline's outline. Notice that this only keys out Marceline's outline and doesn't pick up any lines in the background except for a few scattered pixels. This is because the background lines are a slightly lighter shade of brown. If you can't key out a solid, unbroken outline around the object you're trying to rotoscope without keying out some of the background lines too, this technique won't work. The next step is to add a Shift Channels effect and take red from full off. Images are composed of 3 color channels, red, green, and blue, and one channel called alpha that stores the transparency. This effect essentially turns off the red channel. We'll be using it for our own purposes. Now, add a paint bucket effect. Set the fill selector to alpha channel, and move the fill point over some spot in the background. Notice that part of the background is turned red. Essentially, what we're doing here is 1. Keying out the outline, hence making the alpha channel represent the outlines around the things we want to rotoscope. 2. Removing the existing red channel from the image. 3. Using the paint bucket to reuse the red channel as a mask. There are still certain pockets that the paint bucket hasn't filled in. To mask those out as well, duplicate the paint bucket effect with Ctrl D, and move the fill point inside one of these pockets. Repeat this for however many pockets there are. There's a problem though. These pockets move, and some of them only appear on certain frames. To handle moving pockets, we'll keyframe the fill point properties and use toggle hold keyframe like we did with the mask path. If some of the foreground gets keyed in too, you might have to play around with the fuzziness in the color range effect, or change the tolerance on the paint bucket effect. Eventually, if we reach a frame where there's only one pocket, we'll need to disable one of the paint bucket effects for this frame and this frame only. We can do this by keyframing the Effect Opacity property under the Effect's Compositing options. Note that Compositing options only appears under the timeline. You can't find it in the Effect Controls panel. Effect Opacity basically controls how visible the effect is. 100% means the effect takes full effect, no pun intended, while 0% means it's disabled. You can actually use this technique to enable and disable any effect using keyframes. Remember to use toggle hold keyframe here too. Set the effect opacity to 0, then turn it back up to 100 as soon as the second pocket reappears. Repeat this process until all of the background is red for all frames. Once the background is filled in red for all frames, duplicate the clip and remove all effects from the duplicate, then hide the original. Add a Set Matte effect to the duplicate. Then take matte from the original layer with all the paint bucket effects on it. Change source to Effects and Masks, and then use the red channel. You'll also need to invert the matte. Essentially, what we've done is use the red channel from the other layer as the alpha or transparency channel for this layer. You may notice that the edges appear a bit blocky. Sometimes you'll also notice a bit of the background showing through the edges too, although in this case, doesn't appear to. To fix this, add a Refine Hard Matte effect to access the same feather and decontaminate edge colors options as the roto brush. Make sure to set Reduce Chatter to 0% though, and uncheck Use Motion Blur. All that's left is to mask out any other things that you don't want to use in the shot, and then you're done. I hope you found these tutorials useful. I hope to make more of them in the future, so let me know what you're most interested in learning more about.